All right, so the Chesapeake Bay Sentinel Site Cooperative is primarily a group of marsh ecologists that do long-term monitoring at several sites across the Chesapeake Bay. They primarily use surface elevation tables to monitor elevation change and how marshes are faring against sea level rise. However, this is extremely site-specific, and so they certainly appreciate the value that drones provide in large aerial extents and all the other various assets that drone monitoring can do, but they had a lot of practical questions. And so this inspired our first webinar. This webinar is available from the Maryland Sea Grant website. It talks about purchasing and what sensors you might want to have as part of your drone in this environment, as well as flight design and post-processing. But they got the short end of the stick in terms of time and space, and so we wanted to give those subject matters the highlight of this webinar. Between that webinar and today, we also had an in-person workshop called Coastal Geospatial Horizons. This was great networking. We learned about coastal applications for drones, as well as data storage issues and other troubleshooting. And all those participants, 100% wanted more webinars, hence where we are today. I wanted to share one final resource, which is our story map that it attempts to capture the various drone projects happening across the Chesapeake Bay. So you can see on the story map, here we go, where currently some projects are located. If you click on any one of those, you can learn about the project lead and a project description. And so feel free to explore this, but if you are interested in contributing your own project, maybe folks will reach out to you and want to collaborate or learn more, we would welcome you to do that as well. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. First, Cheryl Doughty, who is an assistant research scientist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and the University of Maryland Earth Systems Science Interdisciplinary Center. Cheryl uses remote sensing to study how coastal wetlands are responding to climate change from centimeter scales measured with drones and across the globe with satellite imagery. Cheryl's going to talk about flight design, and then we're going to pass it to Corey Ongstadt. Corey Ongstadt has been the field technician at the Center for Coastal Resource Management at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science for the last 20 years and has been an unmanned aircraft systems pilot for the past 8 years. He uses drones and GIS technology to study shoreline systems, assess wetland plant communities, and create high-resolution elevation maps. So Cheryl will speak for the first 25 minutes. We'll pass it to Corey, and then we'll have Q&A for both of those topics in the final 5 minutes, though we're welcome to stay past for those able to continue answering questions. As I pass it to Cheryl, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pull up a quick poll. We just want to get a sense of who's in the room in terms of your drone expertise, and as well as if you do use any post-processing software, what do you use? And we'll try to address or tailor our presentations a little bit on a fly to incorporate what you're doing. So Cheryl, if you want to share your screen, and then you can take over in just a minute as these results come in.
Sounds good. Thank you, Taryn.
Thanks, Cheryl. The poll has been open for 30 seconds. We'll give it another 30 seconds before we end the poll. All right, final 10 seconds. Great. So we're so thrilled with the turnout today. We have a pretty even distribution of level of expertise. And then it seems like the most popular post-processing is Pix4D, followed fairly closely by Metashape and Drone2Map. All right, Cheryl, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks again, Taryn, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. It seems like we have a wide range of drone expertise today. And so I will be sharing with you everything that I've learned to help you kind of get started. So this might be geared towards more beginner or novice applications. But thanks for being here. I'm Cheryl Dowdy. Again, I'm an assistant research scientist at UMD Earth Systems Science Interdisciplinary Center, and I'm jointly positioned at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, where part of the science mission is to protect and improve life on Earth using the information and knowledge that we can gain from Earth observation. So today we'll be taking that Earth observation into our own hands. So, in setting up and designing your first flight, there are a lot of things that you need to consider before you even get out to the field. So, we had a whole webinar last year kind of focused on all of these components. You might get a little bit more information there on the different types of drones. But essentially, the key message here is that the drones and sensors that you select should be catered to your research questions and get you the data that you need to answer those questions. So there are a lot of trade-offs in these considerations, things like the make or manufacturer of your drone, the design, the functionality type of that drone, whether it's multi-rotor, fixed wing, or something else, and the payloads that those drones can accommodate. So what cameras and sensors can you put on there? And of course, you have to be considerate of the current laws and regulations that are applicable to you. So for example, something like the NDAA regulations might impact what types of drone manufacturers you can use for your research. So these are all really important things to consider. And again, some of the options for what you might have to go do some research on as you're designing your drone flight study research program. All right, and then another important thing to do before you go is look at your site selection. Again, considering all the laws and regulations that are applicable there, getting the proper permitting and requirements for protected areas and environmentally sensitive areas. And a good way to really increase and improve the data and knowledge sharing on the ground is to partner with organizations that have some science and other efforts going on in these coastal regions. And of course, always check up on the Federal Aviation Administration restrictions. I'm sure a lot of you are looking into your drone pilot certification, doing some testing to get your pilot certification. And then once you do that, also registering your drone with the FAA, and then looking more specifically into the flight requirements around the sites you want to select to understand the restrictions on the airspace there, why it might be protected, and why you don't want to fly in these zones to make it unsafe for other, airborne vehicles. And then, of course, before you go, you want to have a good handle on what the weather predictions are for the time and the year and the week that you want to go do your flights. So there are a lot of different ways to check for a lot of these considerations before you go. I always recommend starting with the FAA as a great source. And here, for example, is the Before You Fly app, where you can see the type of airspace that you might want to fly in. So before you go, it's also important to have a good handle of your field site, really using some geospatial tools to get in there and understand the type of coverage of area that you want to investigate with your drone research, and what that area might translate to if you want to view it with satellites. So here, for example, is a 30 by 30 meter grid that's overlaid on a field site, just to give myself an indication of how many satellite pixels from Landsat we would be looking at, because this might influence where you actually go and collect samples on the ground. And this becomes important when we're working at multiple scales and different accuracies in terms of spatial location, because sometimes we want to ensure that we know where we're going to be doing our sampling and our drone flights. So again, it's just important to kind of investigate the areas that you want to cover and what that might translate to if you're looking at other scales. So a lot of the work that I've done using drones has been with this DJI Matrice 100 equipped with a MicaSense Red Edge camera sensor. So this is essentially a specialized camera with an additional couple bands over the regular RGB that we might get with our cell phones. And these 5 bands are really essential for getting information about vegetation. So it can really help us look at things like vegetation health and biomass, things like that. So this quadcopter again falls within a multi-rotor, quadcopter, small UAV class, under 30 kilograms. So those type of specs will influence some of the regulations that you need to make sure you're doing your due diligence on. Now with this drone, we did a lot of testing to kind of come up with certain flight specs, but ultimately, you have to choose an altitude at which you're flying, a speed at which you're flying, and some of the image overlap that you want to gain during your sampling, because this information will essentially determine how much area coverage and how long one battery might get you to last over your site. So these are some other important considerations for being prepared to know what you can cover with your drones. And then in planning your flight, there are a lot of different software options that are available to you. I think Corey might speak to some of these. There are some options that are commercial versus open source. Some might be more off the shelf or custom. I, for example, did a lot of my flight planning in an app called DJI Go Pro, which is now not existent. I think it's now called the Flight Planner. And there are other options called Pix4D that I think will help you plan your flight as well. But essentially, this is a fast-moving field. The technology is advancing quickly, so do your best to stay up to date with the available tools to you. In these software apps for planning your flight, you'll be setting again those flight parameters, specifically the altitude, the speed, that imagery overlap. And again, these will determine how much battery power you'll need to cover your study area. In those softwares, you can manually set a bound or sometimes upload a shapefile of your site, and you can kind of change the direction of your flight lines. I was taught to always start furthest away and have your drone be on the return as it's doing these flight legs. And the reason for that is because if you have any issues or something goes wrong, you want to be able to bring the drone back home quickly and safely. And again, after you've checked the weather, once you get out to the field, again, considering the environment of your site. So what are the tides going to be like when you go out to fly? What might the light conditions be? So considering these will also influence the drone imagery that you're able to collect and what information you can gather from it. So I conducted a lot of this research that I'll be sharing knowledge with you from, admittedly in Southern California, so not in the Maryland area, but I'm excited to be in this region now. And there's a lot of amazing, great drone work going on here. All right, so again, here's a case study from the Carpinteria Salt Marsh in Southern California, where we're using drones to get an idea of seasonal biomass and how it changes over time. And this is in a drowning salt marsh in Southern California. So here we're able to use our drone to collect imagery and collect field samples on the ground, and then scale that data up to estimate biomass for the whole site. And so I'll be running through this example to demonstrate some more specifics about how we're setting up and how we're flying. So before I would always go out to the field, I would have this pre-trip checklist. I'm a fan of a checklist to keep yourself organized and make sure you have all the gear that you need. Even reminding oneself to charge your batteries and all of your equipment is essential when you're out there doing day after day of field collecting. In addition to your drone being charged and all those components as well, we have a GPS often. In my case, I used an RTK GPS, which I'll talk a little bit about, and any other equipment that might be pertinent to using your UAV. So calibration panels, ground control points, which I'll talk about, a tarp to help set up your home base, and a camera to take pictures of your field site and your plots, etc. And then once you actually get out into the field, the first thing you want to do is, again, survey your site. How do the current weather conditions match up with those predictions you saw? How are the lighting conditions? Is it overcast consistently? Is it partly cloudy and changing all the time? Or is it a full sunny day? Those will impact the quality of your drone imagery and how well it can be stitched together, which Corey will talk about. And again, looking around your site for other hazards and bystanders that you might need to warn or let know what science you're doing. After that, setting up your home base or your ground control station. Then you'll go out and lay different ground control points across your site, which I'll talk about. You might have calibration panels to deal with depending on the sensors on your payloads of your drones. And then you'll go through with collecting your drone imagery and collecting your field samples. So I'll try to walk through some of these in a little bit more detail, but essentially, the ground control station, it doesn't have to be pretty. Home is where the drone is. And the most important thing here is that it's a place that your drone can take off and land free of obstacles. And you also want to be keeping your drone clean throughout this process. So that's where the tarp comes in handy, to not be kicking up dust as we're taking off and landing. So home is where the drone is. And then after you're setting up your home base, you'll go lay your ground control points. So these are fixed reference points with known or measurable locations on the Earth's surface. They're used to help us georeference each of the images in post-processing, and it'll ultimately increase the spatial accuracy of your resulting maps. So these can be made or purchased to suit your needs, but the size of them, the design and the size, requires that they're visible in whatever drone imagery you're capturing. So there's some math you can do to look at ground surface distance or what your resulting pixels will look like in your imagery. But when I was first starting out, I didn't quite do that. And so here's an example of a poorly visible GCP. So in terms of playing with the size of the GCP or the altitude of the flight, we can improve seeing that GCP to help us process our imagery later. So here's an example of how you want your GCPs to be laid, evenly dispersed across the site with at least 5. And so that's 1 in every corner and 1 in the center. And you want them to kind of fully span your site. Again, this will kind of help us georeference those images to each other. And we can do that with really high accuracies using GPS, especially something known as this real-time kinematic GPS, which gets us down to horizontal and vertical accuracies of just a couple centimeters using these RTK stations, which I won't dwell on, but essentially pairing those, using this RTK GPS in the center of your GCPs or your plot locations will help you get really high accuracy measurements of those locations. And so the accuracy of our phones and handheld GPSs is, I think, around like 3 to 5 meters. And the accuracy of our GPS is really just important for, streamlined post-processing and analyses. So using whatever is available to you in terms of a GPS, and then accounting for those accuracies a little bit down the line. All right, and so here's an example of what not to do with GCPs. So they're not evenly dispersed. They're all in the center of our field location, but as students, it's okay to be learning how this works. But essentially what this will do is create spatial errors to the left and the right in this image. So that's something not to do. And, some more lessons from the field. Sometimes when you're flying for a specific application, you won't have a nice home base to set up. You might be flying from a boat and you can't really use GCPs. And sometimes, depending on the application, that's okay, because these cameras have built-in GPSs that will still help us get down to sub-meter accuracies in our resulting imagery. So again, do what you can with what you got. Before you fly your drone, you still might want to take images of, say, your calibration panels. This is often done pre-flight and post-flight. These images show you what 5 bands look like through the MicaSense Red Edge camera. And essentially, these panels will help you calibrate the surface reflectance using known values for the camera based on these calibration panels. So again, it'll kind of help you later in post-processing. All right, once you take these photos, there's really nothing left to do but send up our drone and collect our field samples. So again, out in the field, I would often do this using a checklist. Commercial pilots also use these, so it's a good way to, stay safe and make sure you're doing your due diligence. But again, after you're laying out your GCPs and your flight setup, you'll do some physical checks of your drone, making sure that everything is working properly, clean, not broken or cracked or anything. And you want to make sure that all of your radio and ground systems are talking to each other. Then, without anything left to do, your takeoff procedure can happen in one of two ways. A lot of the flight planning software, they come with really nice automatic ways to kind of take off and land. So they make it really easy to just press go and let your drone go collect your pre-planned flight lines and get your imagery for you. Now, I was taught to always be prepared to manually take off and manually land your drone. And the reasons for this is that basically the built-in GPS on your drone, depending on how good it may or may not be, might not always come back to the same exact place. And you want to be able to make sure you can land your drone safely and without any obstacles in the way. And let's see. So once your drone has landed, then you can begin to collect whatever field samples you might need from the area to finish your research. And so this flight checklist was developed specifically for the DJI Matrice, and this was done way back in 2019 at this point, using guidance from the University of California's drone policy. So do your due diligence, go check your institutions for the most up-to-date guidance. And once we've done all this and we've flown our drones and we've collected our imagery, and Corey will talk about how they're processed, we'll end up getting an image like this, which we can then go out and collect our field samples, which we then can pair with the satellite imagery to perform scientific analyses. So in this case study, again, we're using the information we're collecting from drones and the fields to develop these biomass models that we can then apply to the whole image that we've collected. And when we do that for a couple of seasons, we can get these really amazing, beautiful images of high resolution, habitat cover in marshes, and some predictions of what the above ground biomass is there throughout the year. So always be prepared to manually fly, again, in case you have issues with your Wi-Fi or birds attack your drones, which has happened, or there's a lot of helicopter traffic, like for example, along the California coastline doing some kelp mapping. Then also, be prepared to say goodbye to your drone. Some drones, they can't be saved from accidents or from difficult terrain. So here, for example, we had an equipment failure. An arm basically flew off of our drone mid-flight, and we lost it in these really dense mangroves, and there was no way of recovering it. So this is another example from that area, Baja California Sur, where we just saw those really dense mangroves, where we've applied similar methods to capture mangrove structure and carbon content across a couple different species. I've had the chance to fly just a regular DJI Phantom, just getting the built-in sensor RGB imagery to help validate mangrove classification maps that are really essential to national monitoring of blue carbon. And I also had the opportunity to, collect imagery to help us validate satellite-based methods for monitoring mangrove restoration. So I just wanted to end on some notes of potential applications in tidal coastal wetlands across the world, because there are really countless applications for drones. And so that really covers the bare basics of the design of setting up and executing your very first mission. And hopefully, yeah, we can get into more details in the discussion. But thank you. Up next, we'll be hearing more about the post-processing.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Perfect timing. We do appreciate a lively chat. Thanks so much, folks, for sharing who you are and where you're from. Keep those questions coming. Corey is now in the process of sharing his screen. He's going to do more of a live demo. So Corey, when you're ready, I pass the floor to you.
All right. So now that you've been out in the field and had a wonderful day collecting drone imagery, now what do you do with it? So I'll explain a little bit how we go about taking all that imagery, getting it into a usable form, and then I'll go through some of the programs that we use to process the imagery, and then some of the programs that we use to look at the imagery in GIS and how we can analyze it in there. Again, my name is Corey Angstad. I'm from the Center for Coastal Resources Management at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Again, I've been here for 22 years and flying drones for about half of that time. So it's become really useful for our field work. So we're looking at we do tidal marsh inventories here in Virginia, shoreline inventories. We study living shorelines and how they compare to natural shorelines. So here's an example of a flight that I just did last week. You can see all of the photos there of a living shoreline project that's going in on a Mattaponi Indian reservation. And so we're going out there, we're doing vegetation studies, we're looking at elevation changes and how vegetation is moving into the area. So we did some pre-construction flights, some post-construction flights, and this is the post. So now that I have all this imagery, what do you do? The programs that we use perform a function called structure from motion. So you get a 3D image from multiple pictures. Let me show an example of that. So if you have a camera that takes a picture at several locations, you can stitch them together to get a 3D image. This has really been happening ever since photography has been around, since 1840. You could get a picture at two different angles, put them in this spectroscope and look through it. And as you move it back and forth, you'll get a 3D image. The military has also used this in the past for, on their reconnaissance flights, they take pictures, they're all geo-referenced. They can then get 3D imagery to get a better idea of what's happening on the ground. And that is basically what these programs do. In the 1970s, they started creating algorithms to perform this in the computer environment. And it's become really, really good in the last 10 years. So some of the programs that we use, I'm going to be basically using Pix4D. I think that's the most useful. All the programs do pretty much the same thing, but Pix4D, pretty much does everything. I was going to talk about AggiSoft Metashape, but not everybody can get that anymore since the Russia attacked Ukraine. We can't buy Metashape anymore for some of our federal funds. So, but I'll show you an example of what it looks like in AggiSoft Metashape. There's another program if you want to go free. There's ODM, open source drone mapping. It's really good at orthomosaics. It's not that great at 3D imagery. At least it wasn't a few years ago when I was messing around with it. You can get it basically for free, or there's a version that you pay a few hundred, like $100 for it, and you can get it. But it's not that great for some of the elevation work that we do for our programs. So I'll use Pix4D. So Pix4D, what do you do? So you can see all these are the images that I took. They are, the drone has all the information coming through. So when you add photos, you get your latitude, longitude, your altitude, and also your omega, phi, and kappa, which are basically your pitch, yaw, and roll of the drone as it's flying. So all that data is coming through, and you're getting a good idea of how things are going out there. And then you also have your ground control points. So let me show what that looks like. So you can, the ground control points that we use are called arrow points. We just set them out. They're black and white. Let me bring up an example of one. Yeah. So we have our ground control points out, and you can see them in the imagery here. So that's the ground control point. For our purposes, we fly fairly low, so the arrow point works well for us. They're a bit expensive, so if you don't want to go that route, like Cheryl said, there's quite a few options that you have. You can just use black and white vinyl targets, and if you RTK them in, you have your latitude, longitude, and your X, Y, and Z, all you need. The arrow points were just easier for us, and my colleagues at USGS that I've been working with, they turned me on to them, so it just makes my life a lot easier. I don't have to set up a base station or anything, so it works pretty well. But now that you have your GCPs in, you need to find them in the imagery. So luckily with Pix4D, it pretty much can find them for you, since the latitude, longitude, and elevations are pretty good with the drones these days. So all we do is go into your project. You can click on your GCP, and then you just go through and you start clicking on where the center of the GCP is. And all that information, all you're doing every time you click on this, and this is the most tedious part of the whole processing, because you have to go into all the images with the GCPs and click on the center of them, make sure everything's right. You can do an automatic marking, which the Pix4D will automatically figure out where the GCP is, but you still want to go in and make sure that it's where it's supposed to be. Sometimes it will put a mark off to the side, and you don't want that. It will screw up some of your imagery. So now that we have the photos, so we have the cameras, we have the GCPs, you can run it, you can process it, and Pix4D makes everything pretty much, plug and play. You just tell it what you want it to do, and it will do it. So you have your initial processing, which gives you a sparse point cloud, and then you have your next set of processing, which is your dense points cloud and a triangle mesh. And you can export point files as LAS from this point on. And then the last part is creating a DSM or the mosaic, or when you're dealing with multispectral imagery, you can export indices also. So all you do at that point is, once you have all your imagery in, you just hit start. It runs through it. Depending on how much RAM you have on your computer, you might just want to have a second computer in your office and just walk away and do something else on your other computer. That's typically what I do. I just put all the imagery in, because sometimes you can have, thousands of photos, and it does take a while to process all that, and it takes a lot of RAM. And so I just press start, walk away, and then come back and see how things are going. So once you have, the first thing that's going to happen is your sparse point cloud. So that's what I'm showing here. It gives you a good idea of how things are going, what the imagery is going to show you. You can see dark areas. These areas are areas that have a lot of trees, so I'm not getting a lot of information from those areas. And then the next part is the dense point cloud. And as you can see, it just fills in areas, and you get much better coverage of your sample area. And at this point, you can start deleting out outliers and everything. You can just there's a button up here called clipping, and you just go in there and you start clipping out all the bad outliers that you get. The reason I get a lot of outliers over water is surface from ocean does not work well over water. Any reflective surface, you're going to get, the computer just doesn't know what to do with it. So you get all these weird outliers. So you're going to have to take those out because it will affect your digital surface model, the DSM, at the end. So you want to make sure that you clean that up pretty well before you move on to creating the DSM and the orthomosaic. So let me close that. And then it also creates triangle meshes, which basically just takes the point cloud and the point becomes a vertice, and you just create a mesh that goes over top of your entire survey. And that's kind of what you get there. And as Pix4D is doing this, it's saving so in the point cloud, it's saving a .las file, which is a point cloud that you can pull into GIS later on. It also is creating the orthomosaic and the digital surface model, which you can then, it's a GeoTIFF, and that can also be brought into ArcGIS or GIS platform later on. And I'll go through that in a little bit. So here is your mosaics that are created. So this is an orthomosaic. This can be brought right into ArcGIS, and we use, I'll explain a little bit later what we're doing at this project, but we use this to analyze pre-construction, post-construction, and then further down every year, we'll go out every few months and see how the vegetation is doing at these locations. And you also get your digital surface model, which is this. So it's basically just your elevations, and the ground control points are making everything super tight with your elevation work. So that's what's happening there. And here's an example of your multispectral. So again, multispectral, every time you take a picture, it takes basically 6 pictures every time you take one. So the drone we have anyway, some have more sensors. So every time you take a picture, all those sensors are taking pictures, and you have to organize those and get those into usable format. So ours just does blue, green, red edge, and near infrared. And from that, you can do your different indices. So you can pick NDVI, or you can pick whatever indice you want to do. And it will show you the map, the index map. And then all this can be exported into GIS and analyzed from that point. Or you can, if you don't want to do indices in Pix4D, you can actually export each of the bands into ArcGIS into Esri format, and they have tools in there to run NDVI and NDWI and all the different indices that you have that you would want to look at. All right, so that is basically processing for photos for RGB, your normal photographs, and multispectral. It works pretty much the same. Let me bring up AggieSoft just to show you. So this is AggieSoft Metashape, similar to Pix4D. It does the same thing. You bring photos in, you bring in control points, and you process. The reason I like AggieSoft better than Pix4D is you used to be able to manipulate the outliers easier. There used to be a button in this model drop down that you could go to and pick your ranges that you wanted to for your outliers. So how sure the program is that this is where it's supposed to be. But they've taken that away this last update, so I have to figure out what they're doing. I just got into this today and noticed they updated it, and it's not what it used to be. But again, you just take photos, it creates orthomosaics, it creates DSMs, and you can do multispectral in here also. So now let's move into the GIS world. So I just open up my ArcGIS Pro, and So you can just bring your orthomosaics in. Again, it's just add data and you pick your orthomosaic that you want. This is the one we were just looking at. This is our most recent flight over the Mattaponi reservation. And you can see we did a pre-construction flight. Let's see if that comes up. Oops. There's pre-construction. And then this is post-construction. Boy. So they put in quite a few rock sills along this area. They had a fairly good cliff here. As you can see, even after they put the rock sill in, there was some slumping going on. So we were able to capture that with this imagery. That happened like a week before I flew there. But they created a rock sill and then some oyster sills along this entire area, their entire reservation, just because there was some serious erosion going on there. So now that we have that, we can also bring in you can just bring, all these are TIFFs, so you can bring in the DSMs, the digital surface models. Again, this is just in ARC now, so you can start analyzing. You can pick on points, and it will actually bring up your latitude, longitude, and your elevation for each of those points. And it works pretty well, and we can analyze things later on. So we can see if we are accreting material or if we're losing material at these locations. Just because after these living shorelines are put in, if a storm comes in, we might lose some material, we might gain some material. We just want to keep track of that and watch the vegetation processes that are happening in these areas. You can also go into, since there's an LAS file, which is a point cloud, you can bring that into ARC also. And let's see if this comes up. This might take a while. But it creates a 3D image of your area. So this is the point cloud that was exported as an LAS file. So you can see all the rock sills here. You can also see that we captured some of the stakes that are out for goose netting. That keeps all the critters away from, digging and everything. And so because they just planted this area with new vegetation and they didn't want it eaten. They didn't want the geese coming in and eating everything up. So that is pretty much as far as I'm going to take it with this post-processing. After this, we can then start analyzing all the data, looking at elevations through time and see how everything's going. And I'm going to stop share and have Taryn take over again.
Hi, thanks so much, Corey. We are ready to turn it over to you guys to ask any various questions you may have. Callie has been minding the chat, and I know some interaction has partially maybe answered some of those questions, but we can address them now. I'll also mention that in my experience, folks talking to one another about their specific projects has been really useful, so I don't want to limit the Q&A to just our speakers. So feel free to raise your hand to either ask a question or contribute to an answer as well. We will stay on certainly until 2 o'clock, but if discussion is strong, our team here is willing and able to stay on through 2:15 to continue the discussion and answering questions. I will mention that this meeting has been recorded and we'll record it through 2 o'clock and share that with all the registrants. So from there, Callie, what do you have for us?
So the first question that had come up are if there are any drone training programs that can be used to gain experience en route to certification. I know that there's been some conversation with the chat, but I didn't know if presenters didn't have a chance to see it or if they had any comments about programs people could utilize.
Well, I'll just jump in first and second what Taryn has said, that we're presenting the knowledge that we have to share with you guys today, but I consider the experts in this region and in your own drone research programs. So I am just seconding, more of a discussion if you guys want to chime in. But I guess in terms of some of the other programs for drone development, I saw it in the chat. Blake Steiner had a comment on that. I'm actually not sure. So Corey, I'll let you chime in.
Yeah, I know here at William & Mary and VIMS, we have a program for to become a drone pilot. I'm sure there's quite a few around the United States. It seems that it's becoming more and more useful in the science field, and pretty much everywhere, everybody's using drones. So I have a feeling there's quite a few programs out there that have drone pilot courses. For me, when I first started, it was right at the beginning when the Part 107 was required. So I just went on the FAA site, downloaded as much as I could of information that they had on there, got some books on the remote pilot training, and just read. That's all I did. And then went and took the test and did well. I got a 90 on it, so I did well enough to pass. And so it wasn't too bad. But you have to know, I have some background in, on the water and everything. So I knew charts, I knew weather, I knew, a lot of things already. But all that stuff comes into play when you're getting your drone pilot license.
Great, thank you. More recommendations are welcome in the chat, but we'll move on to, do you have any recommendations for alternatives to the traditional flag GCP? I know anchored flags are the most common, but interested to know other solutions. There was also a couple responses in the chat, but people are welcome to add more.
Yeah, so some of the responses in the chat have alluded to semi or permanent GCPs. So if you're able to do that, if you're going to have repeat visits back to one site and you can, put a rebar out in your marsh or a PVC pipe and get your accuracy for that spot at one point, then you can use that consistently. But yeah, if you don't have that luxury, the GCPs I showed, I'm not sure if there are other non-flag types, but there might be some mentioned in the chat, but if anyone else wants to chime in.
Yeah, and we, for the group that I was working with from USGS, we were looking at eroding bluffs also. So we actually made plywood ground control points. We basically just cut out a square of plywood and painted them because we were using ground-based LiDAR with the drone to survey these bluffs. And so we just hung those off of the face of the bluff so that we could actually GPS those in with the total station. And that worked pretty well because for those bluffs, you can't get a great image with the drone if it's a sharp bluff. So you have to do oblique flights where you face the bluff and you fly along the face and take pictures as you're going. And so we needed to see those ground control points in those flights, and that's how we got around that. But other than that, we're using the arrow points. We started out with the vinyl flags, but and again, like Cheryl said, with a lot of people are they just make a ground control point that is permanent and just go off of that.
All right, thank you. This next question I think is mainly for Corey, but someone was wondering, what is the approximate accuracy of elevation with the method that you demonstrated?
With the method with the arrow points, we can get it down to the Z-axis to about 2 centimeters. That's on the Z. The X and Y is sub-centimeter. If we want to get better than that, we would probably need a total station. And like I said, with the USGS group, we're using ground-based LiDAR to get everything really tight. But it all depends on what you need. So if you're just out there, you just want to get a nice orthomosaic of the area, you don't really need to get that Z axis that great. The drones nowadays with the RTK drones in particular, their latitude, longitude, and their elevations are pretty good already. So you don't have to, you can, as you post process, you don't have to worry about your elevation too much if you're not concerned about that in depth. But for a lot of our surveys, we need to get within that, 1 to 2 centimeter accuracy, if not sub-centimeter for the Z axis. And these arrow points that I use, we leave out for anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours. It depends on how I feel the satellite coverage is. If we're in a bunch of trees, I leave them out a lot longer. Just so they get enough coverage. And the variance that I'm seeing on the arrow points is within a few millimeters, but as I process things, things shift a bit. So we're seeing about 1 to 2 centimeters on the Z, if that helps.
Hey, Sean, would you like to come off mute or add on to any of that?
No, I was just saying, good to see you, Corey. Good to see you, Cheryl. Great job, both of you. Appreciate the overview and everything.
Thanks for joining us, Sean. Callie, I think we have 1 or 2 more questions in the chat.
Yep, we've got 2 more. The next is, can you talk a little bit more about how vegetation index data is analyzed to assess biomass and habitat types?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So from the data you're collecting in the field, those represent points on the earth where you've measured something. And then you can compare that point to the point in your imagery and collect data from that imagery. So that data would be your vegetation indices, your elevation, your surface reflectance in those 5 bands, things like that. And then you create models to basically relate those pieces of information to each other. So those models can be linear regressions, comparing NDVI to above ground biomass, like the example I showed, or to do, classifications. For that one point, you might know what species it is, and then use the information from your drone to say, put that in a random forest model, which will use the spectral indices that are related to that one species at that point, and then use that information to predict if a species is occurring across your entire image. That is kind of translational between species and maybe larger vegetation type covers. But yeah, hopefully I've answered that okay.
Yeah, we've also used, once we get the imagery into the GIS world and I can create polygons around the known species areas, so I can just outline, okay, this is all black needle rush, juncus, whatever, or all spartine alterniflora, all patens. I can then send that to our machine learning people here, and they use satellite imagery, the planet imagery, which can get down to about, I think they have 50 centimeter resolution now on some of their little satellites. And so they're looking at processing the satellite imagery, which can cover a larger area than we're getting with drones. And they're, using modeling to see if they can figure out, okay, this area has a lot of needle rush in it. This area has a lot of alterniflora. It's been useful with Phragmites. Since Phragmites is so tall, we can actually get that from our elevation data. So that's popping out as a much higher plant than most of the other plants that we're seeing in the salt marsh system anyway. So that is what we're doing with that.
I want to keep the conversation going, but realizing that people who do have to adjourn at 2 o'clock, I wanted to launch just one final poll question. This is by no means the end of our discussion, but for folks that are going to drop off soon, we are curious if you would like to attend another drone-themed webinar, particularly in the coastal environment, what sort of topics would most interest you? So please give us your opinion there. And then Callie, I think, yeah, a couple more questions popping up.
Yes, and before we have people hopping off, I can put a final link in the chat, Taryn.
Yes, I referenced a lot of resources at the start of the webinar. Callie's just going to add all those links to the chat again to refresh your memory if you would like to check any of those out. Additionally, we are just beginning to explore whether we should have a more formal community of practice based in the Chesapeake Bay. And so that's really just starting off, but if you are curious, you'll see the final link there is this COP or community of practice form. If you would be interested in what that group might look like, please just complete that form. But back to you guys. I'll just say I'll end the poll in 10 seconds.
Great. So while we're waiting for final responses, the next question is, what's your target number of GCPs per acre for a large site?
Yeah, I think general guidance that I'm reading is about, 10 per hectare. I do think that ultimately the density of your GCPs, with higher density, you'll get higher accuracy. So it's again kind of a trade-off in how many points you need to lay out to get the information you need. But I think generally it's 10 per hectare.
Yeah, I think that's what
Or
we're looking for.
yeah, sorry, go on to Corey.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, 10 per hectare is what we look at also. For some of the smaller areas, since we're just looking at narrow shoreline, sometime we put, 5 out. Minimum is 5 that I usually put out. If you have, when we're doing the bluffs and everything, we put out 10 GCPs on the horizontal plane, and then we put about 10 on the vertical plane, just to cover all of our imagery. But it all really depends on the size of your survey area.
Yeah, in the chat I'm seeing, I mean, those are pretty large areas to survey. So that might be a good instance of using permanent GCPs, or if you don't need really high accuracy in your resulting maps, you could also, get known locations of other locations, like intersections of streets even. So yeah, how detailed you get really determines what you can get from your drone imagery.
I'm sharing results just because it's 2 o'clock. We want to thank our speakers as well as all of our participants again. We do have some leeway to continue this discussion, but I did just want to take this opportunity to, again, thank you so much for your insights and thank you everybody for joining. But passing it back to you all.
Yeah, so we have a,
Oh,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just gonna ask, have either of you flown with LiDAR on drones? We have the capacity. My boss, Stuart Hamilton, has a LiDAR enabled drone, and I have not had the guts to tackle it yet.
My answer is the same. I think my PhD visor now has an even bigger matrice that they have a LiDAR sensor on, but that was after my time. So yeah, that equipment, there's also cost behind all of these pieces of equipment too that we didn't really talk about.
Yeah, and it sounds like, Corey, you're getting 2 centimeters, so that's
Well, so that's
darn
at the ground control points. The problem with just drone imagery is the vegetation is still there. So if you have to take measurements of that vegetation if you want to take that out. So LiDAR will get you bare earth, That's the beauty about LiDAR. You get all that vegetation is gone. That's where the structure from motion kind of fails, is you are just getting the tops of that vegetation. You're not getting down to the bare earth. And that's another thing with the ground control points. I try to get the ground control points in an area that has no vegetation. So it is on the ground and I can interpolate from that area. I'm as far as flying LiDAR, I haven't. We keep on waiting for green laser LiDAR to come out in drone form so that we can do topography surveys, because everything we do is right on the edge of the water. And like I said, in the processing the imagery with water in the photos, it gets really messy really quick.
We can hop to, there's a couple longer questions in the chat, but I can just read this one out. It's an example from Christy, so she's welcome to unmute and explain the situation, but I'll go ahead and read her question. So we use an MLID for a base station with our DJI Matrix RTK plus arrow points. Anyone have any recommendations when flying a long distance from your base station? We are monitoring the chat is stuck, down south in Louisiana, where we can get as far south as possible, but we'll often have to fly around 1.5 miles from our launch site to base station.
Yeah, thank you so much. One of the problems that we have is that we are going a long distance away from our base station. Even when we put ground control points, it's just a lot more correction that we have to do because we're so far away from it. And so I was just wondering if anyone else experiences this, especially for other folks that are monitoring along coastlines or in marsh areas where you can physically only get out so far. And you might can have some people canoe out to put your ground control points, but oftentimes it's just not. I haven't figured it out yet, like how to do it well, and just wanted to see if anyone had any suggestions.
Well, again, you're kind of limited by the environment of your site, right? And so my first idea is to actually go to the processing. And so would it be, so I'm assuming that then the GCPs you're using in the photo processing, sorry, I'm almost curious if you can avoid using them in the pre-processing and then use them to geocorrect afterwards and just rely on the GPS from your drone initially. But since I've turned this into a processing question, I'll let Corey or anyone else chime in. But if anyone has any more practical answers to actually flying your drone that far, yeah, please chime in. And yeah, it's a DJI Matrice, so I know there's limitations to just how far they can go. I don't want to tell you to go get a fixed wing or anything, but I wonder if that might be a nice application for that type of.
Yeah, I've never run into all this. All the things we're doing is our marshes. Some of our marshes are large, but not that large. So everything that we've ever done is I'm well within our. I have GCPs covering the entire flight area. I know the USGS folks that came out with me, they were always complaining because they were up to their knees in mud the whole time. But I don't know. I think what you're doing, if you have somebody canoeing out there and setting out GCPs, that would be good. But the post-processing, as Cheryl said, if you have a base station set up, you might be able to, just do some PPK work and get everything tightened up that way.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, and it looks like our last question for now is from Ryan. He says, Corey, any manual point cloud editing recommendations to address fuzz? Specifically, I had some ATPs hit the side of a shadowed fence post, which sent the ATP down to the shadow realm. I took to orbiting the camera to get the largest amount of fuzz and disable those areas in editing, but wonder if there's a better method.
So in the old Metashape world, I would say that there is a method, but what you're doing right now is really, like in Pix4D, that's all you can really do. In Metashape, there was the option of removing those points. I forget what they called it, but there were 4 different options you can choose from, and you could set your parameters on how you wanted to get rid of that fuzz, basically. And it usually worked pretty well in Metashape. Pix4D doesn't have that. That's why I don't use it as I don't use Pix4D as often as I use Metashape. But yeah, that's a tough one. Did you run into that ever, Cheryl? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm vaguely remembering in that one application looking at the mangrove height, is that's when I really dipped into the point cloud analyses, and it was challenging.
Yeah.
From what I remember, which I also did it in AggieSoft at the time. Yeah, there's essentially a way to classify the points as, I believe, ground or like vegetation surface. So yeah, I think it was kind of part of the classification process of each point. That's vaguely what I remember.
Yeah, and Pix4D you can classify points. It's a little bit more clunky than it is in Metashape, but in AggieSoft, but there is a way to disable a lot of points using Pix4D. So you just have to clip the area that you want to disable, put it into the disable category, and then basically before you process everything, you turn that disabled off, and it won't process those points.
I think that wraps up what I've seen in the chat.
Thanks, Callie. So final call, anybody with any additional questions?
So would flying LiDAR over a subset of those sites kind of clear up the issue with ground versus plants there? Would that be kind of, beneficial way to fix that issue?
Yeah, there is an issue with LiDAR in tidal marshes just because there's so much plant material that's laying over. So you do have to be aware of that. Because we have thought about getting red laser LiDAR for, doing some of our marsh studies, but from what I've read is you can't get through that layer. So some of your areas don't have true bare earth. So you just have to be aware of that. And so you might have to go out and take measurements anyway. But it would help. LiDAR gets rid of a lot of the vegetation. And if you compare the LiDAR to the point cloud that you're getting off of the structure for motion, you might be able to get some biomass from that also, just how tall the plants are and all that good stuff. But I've never done anything like that.
Yeah, that could be a cool analysis. Some more drone applications. Improve our accuracy in measuring plant height using drones. Well, yeah, I'll just second Erin's thank you. Thank you all for your attention today and, letting us share what we've learned with you.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
We really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for sticking through to the end. Still one final chance, but otherwise, thank you all. And I will be in touch to let you know that the recording is available for you to slow down and peruse at your leisure. But everybody enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks.